10 undefeated teams left alive in college football, some of which are super surprising, and others were completely expected to be undefeated by this point. But really, it's this point in the season, right past the midpoint, where some of these stories will either come to a crashing conclusion or some of these teams will prove they're legitimate contenders. So today we're going to take a look at some of the surprising undefeated teams and decide which of them are contenders, actually have a shot at making the playoff and making a run, and which of them are pretenders, teams that'll have their undefeated seasons come crashing down and will probably face a harsh reality check. We are left with a clean 10 undefeated teams headed into Week 9. Those teams are Oregon, Miami, Army, Pitt, Indiana, Penn State, Iowa State, BYU, Liberty, and Navy. And before we can dive into whether some of these teams are contenders or pretenders, let's look at who was actually expected to be undefeated, because those expected to be undefeated aren't the ones we're looking at today. I think there's 3 teams that you can say weren't really a surprise. They were teams that were widely accepted that could be undefeated or probably will be undefeated at this point. Those are Oregon, Penn State, and Liberty. Liberty, it's just by virtue of their schedule being super easy and super light. Now, you could argue they could go undefeated this season, and if they do, the committee would probably be willing to put them in the playoff, regardless of how good you actually think they are compared to their weak schedule. And then for Oregon and Penn State, widely accepted as contenders because they're not really a surprise. We have the somewhat surprising tier, which is where I'd put Miami and Iowa State. The reason I say somewhat surprising is because I'm a guy who said they were both going to be undefeated by this point. I don't think the general public necessarily believed that for these teams, maybe more so for Miami. Miami is one of the teams favored to win the ACC this offseason because people were high enough on them. But for Iowa State, definitely a surprise to most people. But for me, I would consider both of them contenders because I considered them in the offseason. So I wouldn't consider those ones surprising, which leaves us with the remaining 5 of Indiana, BYU, Pitt, Navy, and Army. So we asked the question, with these 5 undefeated teams, are they contenders? Let's start with Army. Army, the Black Knights, are a team that thus far in the season doesn't have any crazy key wins. They've beaten Rice and East Carolina, which I would say are their best wins, but they've blown everyone out. They have not trailed in a game this season, and that's something that only, I believe, 2 teams can say now, Army and Indiana, and they've just crushed everyone. We'll talk about Indiana later. Their X factor has been Bryson Daly at quarterback. He's completely transformed their offense. And Jeff Monken, he's been a stable presence for them at the head coaching position for a long time. And I think he's starting to get a little bit more recognition this season with how fantastic of a season Army is currently having. Now, they've got some big games remaining. Their biggest games are all out in front of them. They still have to play Notre Dame. They play North Texas, a team that's having a really good season. And they play Navy, a team that's also currently undefeated. But you look at those games, they really just have to make sure they take care of business versus North Texas and Navy, and they could afford to lose the Notre Dame game and still be a team that could be a college football playoff contender. When I looked at Army going into the season, I had them circled as a team that I really thought could have a breakout season in the American. Now, thus far, they're blowing out even my expectations, which were already sky high for Army, but they played one of the toughest schedules, and I believe the toughest out of the entire group of 5, if that's how you're measuring it, and they go into the American. So they're getting a lot more breaks this year, a lot more games that are more winnable than they dealt with last season, which was a relatively disappointing 6-6 season. And so for Army, it's been pretty much what I thought could happen, plus a little bit extra. And I look at that schedule down the stretch, I'm going to say contender. The Army Black Knights are absolutely a team that can crash the college football playoff party, win the American Conference, and be a factor in this playoff race. It's only appropriate to follow up talking about Army by talking about Navy. The midshipmen actually have a more impressive resume thus far than Army has. They've beaten a Charlotte team that was actually rolling last week. They crushed them, and they also have a win over Memphis, which was arguably the top American Conference contender, and I believe the odds-on favorite to win the conference, a team I thought would win the conference. Navy beat them in a really impressive win. Their X factor has also been their quarterback. Blake Horvath has completely transformed what Navy's capable of doing. The things we've seen this Navy offense doing this season have far surpassed what we thought was possible for this program. And what's been really surprising about Navy is the fact they were in the American last season and they missed a bowl game. They went 5-7. So they already had a year, and it seemed like they were a more proven commodity as a team that wasn't going to take the American by storm. So there was a lot more confidence to be had in Army as a team that was just taking their first step into the American. But for Navy, the road ahead is a lot rockier than Army. They have to play Notre Dame, South Florida, which is a sneaky game that wouldn't look good on a resume with a loss, Tulane, which is a team that is rolling, and then they also have to play Army. So if I look at Navy's schedule, doesn't matter how good they played, how good their resume is so far. I just think that schedule is too tough down the stretch. And you're talking about wins and losses and having to play Army. I just don't know if Navy's going to have the resume needed. They would have to beat Notre Dame, and then they'd have to beat one of Tulane and Army. And at this point, I do like Army a little bit more than Navy. So I'm going to say Navy is a pretender. And I know it hurts to hear for the midshipmen, but continue to prove me wrong. It's what they've been doing all season long. We'll see if they can keep it going. What about the Pitt Panthers? I would argue this is the most pedestrian undefeated team left. Not a ton of people are talking about Pat Narduzzi's squad, and yet they have arguably one of the best resumes of an undefeated team because of these quality wins that have rolled in. They've beaten North Carolina, Cal, Cincinnati, West Virginia. Nothing that jumps off the page to you, but a bunch of really solid teams. And if you look at Army and Navy schedules, they haven't beaten anyone as impressive as Pitt has, and yet Pitt's not being talked about because they're not as flashy of a team to talk about. And the X factor for them this season has been Cade Bell. He's completely transformed this offense that was a huge liability last season, and Narduzzi showing a willingness to change this year, and it's really helped them. And the remaining big games, they've got them all in front of them. They still have to play Syracuse this Thursday. They still have to play SMU. They still have to play Clemson. They still have to play Louisville. That is SMU and Clemson, arguably two of the top three ACC contenders, arguably the favorite right now in Clemson, a Louisville team that's really good, a Syracuse team that's really good. That's really sketchy for Pitt, and so I love how they played. I wish more people were talking about them, but when we're talking about actual title and college football playoff contention, I'm going to say they're a pretender. It's just too tough of a road ahead for Pitt, but a great resurgent season for this program and something they should seriously be proud of. What about Curt Cignetti's Indiana team? I would argue this one is the most surprising team that not many people saw coming. Now, there was a lot of people talking about this team potentially being good and improved, but there was no way to know the portal additions were going to gel this fantastically. It just hasn't really been seen before. And if you look at their key wins so far, Nebraska was the emphatic one on the national stage. They win 56-7. That was huge, but that's been the best opponent they've played. Maryland, Northwestern, you could count as their other signature wins, but those are lower rung Big Ten teams. They truly haven't been tested by a tier 1 contender or even really a tier 2 contender to this point, although I would say they themselves have reached probably that status. And the X factor, obviously Curt Cignetti. He's taken over this team and this roster and completely flipped them. Now, they've got some big games remaining. They still have to play Ohio State. They still have to play Michigan. They still have to play Washington. And then you can put a period on that sentence because their other games are very winnable. This has suddenly gotten to the point where an Indiana playoff spot seems more likely than not. They have to avoid an upset versus Washington and an upset versus Michigan. Their only game they'll be underdogs in the rest of the way is Ohio State. So Indiana, absolutely a contender. It's a team that it took a while for me to get warm on, but it is impossible not to like what Curt Cignetti is doing. Indiana football is in a prime position for a college football playoff run. Last but certainly not least, we have the BYU Cougars, who are also having a completely magical season this year. They have, I would say, more impressive wins than anybody else we've talked about. I know I said Pitt had some really underrated ones, but BYU, the win on the road versus SMU has aged like fine wine, and the win against Kansas State has also aged incredibly well. Kansas State is playing like the best team in the Big 12 right now, and BYU crushed them, and they beat SMU. And they also have wins over Oklahoma State and Arizona, which are nothing to shy away from. Those are also really nice victories. Their X factor for them has been their defensive line play, and it's been the turnover margin. They have just forced turnovers in all the right places this year to put themselves in the best position. I mean, they just took Kansas State out of that game entirely by forcing turnovers. The game against SMU, they forced a ton of bad plays and mistakes by the other team, and that's been their X factor this season. They've got some remaining games against Utah, UCF, Arizona State. They're all very winnable games for BYU. But if you look at the way they've been playing, their style of play, how they've been winning football games, I just can't help but feel like it isn't super sustainable. And we've seen some of the cracks over the last couple of weeks, particularly against a not very good Oklahoma State team. We saw the Cowboys kind of stick around, and so I know BYU's passed a couple tests. I know they look really great right now, but there's a reason that they're only a 1-point favorite, nearly a pick 'em against UCF this week, and it's because I think there's just a few volatile factors that have so far been going in BYU's direction, like that turnover margin, and I think it's just going to catch up to them. I think they're going to get clipped a couple times late in the season, and I am probably one of BYU's bigger detractors at this point, but I'm going to call them a contender. And if BYU proves me wrong, I guess they own me this season because I've been consistently wrong about them. But I do think they're going to stumble a couple times down the stretch and prove to be a pretender.